It's that time of year again where I present the most prestigious award in all of the bike industry. That's right, the Most Supple Bike of the Year award. And you can tell it's prestigious because we have multiple laurels in our badge. More laurels, more prestigious. But in all seriousness, this is where I present to you guys the bikes that were most interesting and exciting to me. I know what you're asking, what is the criteria for the most prestigious bike award in all of the bike industry? Well, this is where it gets a little bit fun because it's always changing. But generally speaking, a supple bike is one that is multifaceted. So a good balance of performance and functionality and fun. And of course, a supple bike has to have a supple ride. So nice, comfortable, and smooth and plush. And lastly, the bike has to be interesting. I just don't want a sauced up road bike or cross bike that's rebranded as a gravel bike. It has to bring something new and unique to the table. All the bikes I reviewed this year, like in previous years, none of them were paid for. I either returned the bike or purchased the bike, and I didn't take any advertising money from the brands. So these opinions are completely my own. In this video, I'm going to award the overall most supple bike of the year as well as my budget pick. All right, so let's get into it. There's gonna be two runner-ups to the overall category, and the first one is the very supple and very interesting Bear Claw Thunderhawk. This is an all titanium bike with a tie segmented fork, which is not only compliant, but also super functional because you can put racks and all that stuff on the bike. I love the geometry of the Thunderhawk. It's pretty close to last year's most supple bike, which was the Crust Bambora. So if you've been lusting after a tie version of the Bambora, Bear Claw Thunderhawk comes pretty darn close. Second runner up for the most supple bike of the year is actually a bike that I didn't expect I would like because it's carbon, and it is the Otso Wahila C. Typically, while I appreciate the light weight and kind of snappy feeling of a carbon bike, the general riding feels a little dull and overly stiff to me, but somehow not so with the Wahila C. A pretty awesome feature of the Wahila C is that you can adjust the chainstay length, and it feels like two distinct bikes. In one setting, you get something that feels like a Salsa Warbird, and in the more tuck setting, you get something that feels like a Salsa Warroad. So snappy and road bike-like in one end of the spectrum, and smooth and plush and comfy on the other side of the spectrum. For a carbon bike, the Wahila C to me was pretty compliant. I'm not sure if it's their carbon layup or whatever voodoo that they use, but that smoothness really stuck out to me more than any other carbon bike I've rode in the last couple years, to be frank. I actually enjoyed the Wahila C more in the long chainstay mode, and riding that bike really influenced my pick for the overall most supple bike of the year in 2020. So Otso Wahila C, if I were to buy a carbon gravel bike today, it would be that one. All right, so here we are. What is the most supple bike of 2020? This is gonna maybe come as a shock, a little bit of a surprise. Some of you might think it's a cop-out, but it's actually a tie between two bikes which are similar in some ways and different in a lot of other ways. And the two most supple bikes of 2020 are the Richie Outback and the Rivendell Sam Hilborn. The 2020 Richie Outback is pretty interesting. It's a complete ground-up design, totally different from the first Richie Outback I reviewed. That older one was kind of a monster cross bike. This one is a completely different beast. It maintains relatively light tubing, non-tapered headset, super compliant front end. One of the biggest changes is the longer rear chainstay. Looking at this bike on a geometry chart, I would have thought that this bike, not for me. But riding it, the bike is super plush, especially when descending the rough stuff. One thing I appreciate about the 2020 Outback is that it really bucks the trend of the tucked gravel bike. I like that it did something different and it executed it pretty well. The longer in comparison rear chainstay just means that it descends super smoothly on pavement as well as gravel, and the front end still remains shockingly compliant when compared to lots of bikes I've reviewed on the channel. I was so close to buying the review sample. Ultimately, the inability to run a front rack was what prevented me from doing it, but if they ever come out with this geometry with a alloy fork of some sort, definitely putting that on my wish list. Tied for the most supple bike of 2020 is the Rivendell Sam Hilborn. In some ways, a very different bike from the Richie Outback, but also in some ways pretty similar. Differences are pretty obvious. This is more classically styled, if you will. It's rocking the quill stem and rim brakes, which I know is not to everybody's taste, but provides a lot of compliance in the front end that you don't get from a bike with a big honkin' tapered head tube and overbuilt fork. Both these bikes have the compliance and suppleness baked in, rather than creating a stiff platform and then trying to retroactively soften the ride. That just seems asinine to me. The Hillborn in the rear also sports a really long rear chainstay, which, just like the Outback, translates into a smooth descending bike, both on pavement and especially in the rough stuff. As I've gotten older, I do appreciate a nice snappy climbing bike, but I also realize one of the things holding me back is descending. When it's too short and jumpy, you just never really settle in on the descent. But with both the Outback and the Hillborn, I can descend pretty confidently. So those are the two most supple bikes of 2020. Very similar, but also very different depending on taste. If you want something more modern, definitely go with the Richie Outback. If you're a save the rim brake kind of person, then definitely go with the Rivendell Sam Hillborn. And as a side note, I did end up purchasing the Rivendell Sam Hillborn because the bike is so beautiful and rides so well. All right, so now for the most budget-friendly Supple Bike of the Year award, and I can already see you typing, what do you mean? The bike is more than $100, it's not budget. Look, in the grand spectrum of things, these bikes are indeed budget. When you look at how much bikes can cost, whether it fits into your budget, that's up to you to answer. So to be clear, these are my most supple bike picks in the sub $2,000 and sub $1,000 mark. In the sub $2,000 mark, it is the Kona Libre aluminum. That's right, an aluminum bike can be supple. What I love about the Kona Libre is that it's super functional. It has all the rack mounts. You can put a rear rack on it. You can put anything cages in the front. It's got decently good tire clearance at 45 millimeters. And it also has a nice and chill geometry. So higher stack height, it's not a pretend racing bike. It's a bike for most people. You can actually get into the drops with that higher stack height. And it's also an incredibly smooth riding bike. Again, slightly longer chainstays for that comfortable and stable ride. And if you watch my full-on review of the video, it's kind of like a more chill Salsa Warbird or a Cutthroat with slightly less tire clearance. I think if this bike came OEM with some 650B tires or had just a little bit more clearance, it would have been a contender for the overall category. But as it is, it's a great value for the money and could be all the drop bar road-oriented bike a person could ever want. And lastly, the sub $1,000 category. So a couple of years ago when I started doing bike reviews, it was pretty slim pickings in that sub $1,000 mark. Yes, there were bikes that existed, but there were always a compromise, weren't very exciting, overly heavy, all that stuff. A lot has changed in a couple years. So my pick for the sub $1,000 most supple bike of the year is the Poseidon Redwood. This is such a cool bike for the money. It has kind of, I don't want to say boutique-y geometry, but usually you don't see geometry like this pushing the envelope in a sub $1,000 bike. Usually that's reserved for bikes that cost $2,000, $3,000, or $4,000. But here you get a bike that's not afraid to be weird for not a whole lot of money. It's got clearances for fat meats at 2.5 inches, higher trail front end, kind of medium length rear end. So essentially a drop bar mountain bike, which is super unique for this price point. Usually around here, a lot of brands will play it safe and they'll rebrand a cross bike or maybe add clearance to a road bike to appeal to that quasi, performance oriented but budget market. But here Poseidon went full on, we're gonna make a bike packing monster cross gravel bike. You get all the mounts, so the bike is super versatile and functional, and it's one of the most appropriately geared bikes, period. Most gravel bikes are overgeared in my opinion. For whatever reason, they're too afraid to go below that 1-to-1 gear ratio, but not Poseidon. They spec'd it out great with microshift and a small front chainring. So gearing that matches the bike, the use, and the user. So kudos to Poseidon. So those are the most supple bikes of 2020. Were there any surprises to you guys? If you have any questions about the bikes, leave those in the comments below. And if you've enjoyed the bike reviews, accessory reviews, bag reviews, this year and the previous year, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. You get up to 20% off lots of the brands that I review. They don't pay me to be part of the program. These are brands that are stoked to support the community. Again, the channel operates on your direct support. We haven't done a sponsored video in 2020. or 2019. So you guys make it happen. So until next time, keep the supple side down.